Good afternoon, everybody. Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Signaland, Shenzhen, just south of the Tropic of Cancer. And we're having just the most amazing spring. Every night it gets down to about 18, 19 degrees. In the day it's getting up to about 22, 23. We're really enjoying the sort of East African, Nairobi, Harare weather here. Of course, in June and July, it will not be the same. It'll be like a hot bath in here. All right. This is a special edition for fans, followers, listeners, and watchers of China Rising Radio Signaland to honor the establishment of the nascent American Bioweapons Truth Commission, ABTC is its abbreviation, and its global online library, GOL. Below is a chapter from the second book of the China trilogy, China Rising, Capitalist Roads, Socialist Destinations, pages 94 to 105 by yours truly. Pictures, bunches and bunches of really good hyperlinks if you want to do more research on this unbelievably sordid and criminal chapter in Western history. The article, the chapter's picture in this case is Lon Chaney acting in Phantom of the Opera, unmasked, channeling Western Empire. All right, after that picture byline, here we go. For the 85% of the world's people who are not among Western Empire's sheeple, that being sheep people, these are trying times in the age of colonialism, like for the last 500 years. Westerners have a history of using humans as guinea pigs for all kinds of horrific experiments and eugenics. The Spanish Inquisition, medieval torture of witches, and later the Nazis come to mind. In the days of our lives, the CIA gleefully tortures or teaches others to torture for hire. Not so long ago, upstanding leaders of Western-style democracy vociferously sterilized hundreds of thousands of unwitting citizens. The United States targeted blacks, Native Americans, and Puerto Ricans. All the perpetrators targeted those who are perceived to be inferior races. Some of the programs continued well into the 1970s. This hall of shame includes Canada, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Israel, of course, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States, among others. Australia, Canada, and the United States, even into the 1970s, were tearing apart many thousands of native families by forced removal of children to be sent to colonial schools where they could learn the superiority of white man's culture and Christianity. It was benignly termed cultural assimilation, but in reality it was ethnic genocide. In the 1940s, Guatemala, the United States purposely infected thousands of natives with syphilis and gonorrhea to test these human guinea pigs with antibiotics. Of course, these suffering souls were sexually active for the rest of their lives and unwittingly infected everybody they came in contact with, including spouses. Thus, the total number of people who were eventually infected, including children born with these diseases, would total in the many thousands. Lots of lives were destroyed in the process. But for empire, that's no problem, because dark-skinned Guatemalans are less than human. At Tuskegee Institute, American blacks were treated just as inhumanely. Hundreds of them were allowed to carry syphilis from the 1930s to the 1970s to act as human petri dishes. This was to track the progress of the disease and observe the eventual macabre deaths that this bacteria is wont to inflict on its victims in its final stages: insanity, nervous disorders, liver and heart disease. The United States has a long, illustrious history of using bioterrorism around the world. Cuba has been a favorite target and has seen hundreds of thousands of its people infected with dung fever, which is a close cousin of Ebola, later on that, as well as its entire swine herd wiped out by swine fever. Biochemical weapons go way back, and since the 20th century, the West has been and continues to be their most avid users. The United States is the biggest user of, in parentheses, bio and chemical weapons in history, including in places like Cuba, Iraq, Syria, Iran by proxy, Serbia, Japan, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and America has eagerly used them on its own people, apparently more often than we care to admit. With this lengthy rap sheet and any doubts you may have about the evilness of empire, just take a look at the real story behind the nascent Ebola outbreak. Did you know that the United States of America holds the exclusive patent on the Ebola virus? It's right there in the public records. U.S. patent number 201-202-51502, owned by the American government. Ebola has been Uncle Sam's bioweapon plaything since 1976, when it was discovered in Zaire and shipped 3,500 kilometers by America's biowarfare lab at Fort Detrick, Maryland, then to West Africa for cultivation and development via the UK's biowarfare labs in Porton Down, and with the help of the World Health Organization, specifically to Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, the current epicenters of the Ebola epidemic on the great continent. And there's actually a picture of the Ebola virus, and the byline says, Ebola virus, U.S. patent number 201-202-51502, patent owned and controlled by Uncle Sam. The United States, in complete contravention of the International Biological Weapons Convention, operates biowarfare laboratories in these impoverished puppet states, infecting unwitting African human guinea pigs with the Ebola virus with the purported intent of developing a vaccine. Don't believe me? The study was announced business as usual on an official U.S. government website. Tecmira Pharmaceutical, a Canadian company, won the contract and is doing Western Empire's evil Ebola work on West African human subjects. Tecmira is being paid $140 million of Americans' taxpayers' money to flout international law and all boundaries of human decency. Why even be working with the deadly Ebola virus and hold a patent on it just to develop a vaccine? Or is it really a case of genetically modifying the Ebola virus in these two African American laboratories to make it even more lethal as a bioterrorism weapon? American biological warfare researchers have been working in West Africa for years. They don't give a damn about vaccines for humanity's sake, although they are probably creating vaccines to protect themselves when the genetically modified version is used against America's targeted enemies. The first job of U.S. biowar laboratories is to create ever more powerful, weaponized bacteria and viruses. Westerners get their panties all in a knot for using laboratory animals to test new products. Oh, those poor, helpless rabbits, cats, dogs, and monkeys. Where is the moral outrage at using fellow human beings to create biowar Ebola bombs? Given that the people being sacrificed are poor, nameless black Africans, it is hard to avoid the racial overtones to humanity's total lack of concern. The World Health Organization, WHO, and America's Center for Disease Control, the CDC, look mighty suspicious in all this travesty. U.S. law professor Francis A. Boyle, B-O-Y-L-E, who drafted the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989 and the American legislation for the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, says they are fully implicated, the WHO and CDC are fully implicated in the seemingly intentional spread of Ebola and not to be trusted, outright calling them liars. Mr. Boyle says that the CDC works hand in hand with the Pentagon's bioweapons program and that WHO is complicit in these developments as well. It wouldn't be so comical if it weren't so serious, reading how now deceased Ebola patient Thomas Eric Duncan was practically used as a vector to spread the disease in a Dallas, Texas hospital. It must be said, though, that in America, where every patient is a point of sale, every medical intervention a profit center, and where every procedure or regulation that does not generate money is considered a burdensome cost, this Keystone Cop Looney Tunes gross malfeasance could be chalked up to just plain old corporate greed. However, having discovered that Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital is a non-profit, we can assume that the Duncan case was not due to greed, but was an ex-Africa Ebola epidemiological experiment. This hospital's nurse's statement confirmed as much, testifying that the CDC, which had personnel on site, refused to provide an Ebola protocol for them to follow, and that the whole affair looked like it was trying to test the infection capabilities of whatever variety of Ebola Mr. Duncan had been inoculated with. These are professional nurses saying this at great risk to their careers and or lives. One can assume the CDC representatives had probably already received the Pentagon's vaccine against this particular strain developed in its West African labs. The whole sordid story stinks to high heaven. Disaster teams were told months in advance to be ready for an Ebola outbreak in the U.S., specifically in the month of October. What did they know was on the Pentagon's biowar calendar that we didn't? Also, why did the U.S. State Department buy 160,000 biological hazmat suits in September specifically for Ebola exposure? What does Ebola protection have to do with states' supposed mission, foreign affairs? It sure sounds like they knew in advance that something was going to happen. In light of all the evidence presented and referenced in this chapter, the 10 points brought up in this article just pile the questions and suspicions ever higher. Here are the bullet points. Number 1, Obama refuses to halt air travelers from infected countries from entering the United States. Texas family is quarantined in a home that still has not been cleaned or decontaminated. The CDC continues to lie about modes of transmission for Ebola virus. The FDA is openly threatening sellers of natural remedies that might be useful for slowing or stopping Ebola. Number 5, people entering U.S. customs are not asked where they've been. The U.S. government knew about the outbreak in advance but didn't warn the public. Even during a global pandemic outbreak, the U.S. government refuses to secure the southern U.S. border. Number 8, the government's official advice of don't panic, don't prepare ensures a greater pandemic emergency during any outbreak. Number 9, the U.S. watched and waited, doing nothing during the original window of opportunity for halting Ebola during the first 6 weeks. And number 10, the U.S. government has held the patent on Ebola since 2010. I ask you, Does this look like a government bent on stopping Ebola or wanting to test how the latest version spreads? And for me, the crown jewel in all this, the bright red cherry on top of this ghoulish Halloween nightmare, is not Lon Chaney unmasked in Phantom of the Opera, but the other Chaney, Dick to be exact, the still reigning president of America's deep state and master of its continuation of government, known as COG, said this on October 13, 2014. "We're in a very dangerous period. I think it's more threatening than the period before 9/11. I think 9/11 will turn out to be not nearly as bad as the next mass casualty attack against the United States, which, if and when it comes, will be with something far deadlier than airline tickets and box cutters." Does Herr Chaney know something we are not privy to? Is he using the classic deep state / CIA ploy of projecting a false flag operation to validate in all the minds of the people once it is or to validate it in the minds of all the people once it is perpetrated? And there's a great photo of Dick Cheney, and the byline says, "The psychopath with the deep state plan sure seems to be slobbering for a new, bigger 9/11. However, unlike chemical weapons, bioweapons are fiendishly difficult to get to work consistently and repeatedly in a variety of environments and situations. They are living creatures after all. So far, we may be in luck. Just studying all the evidence discussed in this chapter, it seems that quite possibly the perpetrators' hopes were that the newest bred American patented strain of Ebola would be infectious via airborne vectors such as sneezing and coughing. This vector may not be working as planned. That's the good news. The bad news is that America's Fort Detrick, the UK's Porton Down, the CDC's biowarfare labs in West Africa, and heaven help us, what is ongoing in other countries around the world, they are all still working 24/7 to create mass murder on a tactical, regional, or global scale. If you think this is preposterous, the U.S. military refuses to promise it will not weaponize Ebola. As far back as 1995, the U.S. Army was experimenting with lethal Ebola aerosols on rhesus monkeys. Facts on the ground today suggest that they have not stopped trying to get aerosol Ebola to work. In other words, they are creating an Ebola bomb. This must explain why Obama sent 3,000 U.S. Army soldiers to West Africa to combat Ebola. How many of these soldiers have been trained in the use of transporting, handling, and delivering biowar vectors? After all, Ebola is America's very own viral bioweapon Frankenstein. Remember that 1972 Biological Weapons Convention that the United States brags about creating and signing? Just another quaint treaty to wipe Uncle Sam's rear end with. Heck, the 1%, their princes of power and mercenary Praetorians, could do with a little bit of Lebensraum these days. Count 'em, 7.3 billion souls. Wiping out 1 billion or 2 dark-skinned Africans, Asians, or Americans would sure do the trick. If this sounds outrageous, remember that Western elites have been barking for reduced world population since Robert Malthus wrote his essay on the Principle of Population in 1798. Colonialist Mr. Malthus was not at all worried about privileged elites multiplying. His concern was the poor and uneducated classes in England and all those exploited, teeming subjects populating Britain's resource-rich colonies around the world. Since then, many of the world's mostly white Western 1% have not been and continue to not be bashful about the desire to see planet Earth's human population drastically reduced. CNN founder Ted Turner unapologetically said, a total population of 250 to 300 million people for the entire planet. A 95% decline from present levels would be ideal. Most of the time, this Western fear of the dreaded other, the world's 85% dark-skinned citizens, is more subtly conveyed in the mainstream media. Roger Martin in The Guardian sums up nicely the common refrain of the world's privileged class. All environmental and many economic and social problems are easier to solve with fewer people, and ultimately impossible with even more. On a finite planet, the optimum population providing the best quality of life for all is clearly much smaller than the maximum permitting bare survival. The more we are, the less for each. Fewer people means better lives. Again, Mr. Martin, like Malthus, is not worried about his people. He's talking about Earth's 6 billion people who survive on less than $10 a day. Quotations and their implicit wishes on depopulation from elite Westerners are a dime a dozen. America's development of a weaponized Ebola virus plays into this common sentiment among the West's elites. For planet Earth's owners, what's left of the West's ever-shrinking middle class could stand to have its lawn mown too. You can just hear those Western elites saying, "Heck, just brush hog all that human undergrowth. The 99% are more pesky and parasitic than mesquite and cedar trees on Oklahoma grazing land, just wasting valuable resources. Ebola, why, it's a new kind of forced sterilization / population control program on a logarithmic scale. Just think of all the spacious, guarded communities we could have, the country clubs and golf courses. Each of our mansions with square kilometers of privately owned natural parkland. Why, it's the American dream on mega steroids." This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising, Radio Sinoland, signing out from Shenzhen. Bye-bye.